A shocking act of humiliation takes place in a federal court in Chicago. A white police officer, known for his aggressiveness, publicly shaves the head of an arrested black woman on orders and according to procedure, right in the courtroom, before the hearing even begins. He doesn't know that this woman will punish him forever. Chicago, a city of proud resilience and deep-rooted contradictions. A metropolis where vibrant cultures collide with a long, painful history of systemic injustice. It is in this urban crucible, where the scars of discrimination run deep and memories of past injustices echo through the streets, that our story unfolds. In the cavernous halls of a federal courthouse, under the gaze of both hopeful advocates and cynical skeptics, a defining moment was poised to shatter the oppressive silence that had long cloaked the city's criminal justice system. For decades, Chicago's police force had been synonymous with an aggressive style of law enforcement, a method that often bordered on brutality, particularly against its most vulnerable citizens. Stories of wrongful arrests, disproportionate use of force, and blatant instances of racial discrimination were whispered in neighborhoods and splashed across headlines. The public's trust in the system had been eroded by years of abuse and neglect. Within this charged atmosphere, every action, no matter how routine, was imbued with the potential to either inflame passions or usher in a long-awaited reconciliation. It was against this backdrop that Vanessa Brixon emerged, a woman whose unwavering commitment to justice was forged from her own personal encounters with the cruelty of a biased system. Born into a community where hope was a hard-won gift, and where the weight of prejudice was felt in every unyielding glance, Vanessa had risen above the circumstances that sought to define her limits. Her early life was marked by the harsh realities of racial discrimination. She lost loved ones to senseless acts of violence and witnessed friends and neighbors suffer under the boot of systemic oppression. These experiences, painful as they were, kindled in her a fierce determination to transform the system from within. Vanessa's journey led her, against considerable odds, to the bench of the federal court in Chicago, the very arena where the forces of injustice and inequity had long reigned unchecked. Under her calm, dignified exterior, there burned a fire of righteous indignation. But Vanessa was not one to wage a war with overt force. She chose instead the power of quiet resolve and moral authority. Behind her unassuming smile lay the fortitude of someone who understood that true reform begins with bearing witness, with challenging assumptions, and most importantly, with speaking truth to power, even when that truth was cloaked in silence. For months, Vanessa had meticulously gathered evidence, listened to the anguished testimonies of victims, and pored over records of misconduct. A clandestine investigation aimed at exposing the pervasive corruption and racism that had infested the halls of justice. Her mission was personal. It was not enough to simply document the horrors. She believed that every instance of injustice was an opportunity to reclaim the dignity of those who had been trampled by the system. With each piece of evidence she collected, Vanessa became more resolute in her belief that the law must serve as a shield for the oppressed, not a weapon against them. On this particular day, an unremarkable morning had given way to an undercurrent of tension that pulsed beneath every stone of the courthouse. Outside, Chicago's chilly winds carried murmurs of discontent and anticipation. Inside the federal courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation. A silence punctuated by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the measured footsteps of lawyers and bailiffs. The courtroom itself was a paradox of austere modernity and classical dignity. Its marble columns and time-worn benches a solemn reminder of a storied, if flawed, legal tradition. Unbeknownst to most, Vanessa had taken a daring step further in her undercover mission. In preparation for a landmark investigation into police brutality and racial discrimination, she had assumed a covert identity. Disguised as an ordinary member of the accused, a strategy contrived to observe firsthand the interplay between law enforcement and the legal system, she had arranged to be present in the courtroom that day. Only a handful of trusted allies knew her true identity, and none knew the quiet strength that lay beneath the unassuming disguise. That morning, as whispers of a high-profile case began to circulate among the courthouse staff and the local community, there was also a palpable sense of foreboding, a feeling that justice, which for so long had been perverted and warped, might finally be confronted with an unyielding demand for accountability. Every detail, from the echo of distant footsteps in the corridor to the methodical arrangement of documents at the prosecutor's table, spoke of a system on the brink of transformation. In these charged moments, when the past and the present merged into a single decisive point, every observer in that sacred space, from the seasoned judge to the nervous security guard at the entrance, seemed to sense that something monumental was about to occur. For Vanessa Brixon, this was not merely another day in a city marred by injustice. It was the prologue to an act that would force even the most entrenched figures of law enforcement to reckon with their own complicity in a long history of racial humiliation. Little did anyone know that within the span of a single morning, the courthouse would become the stage upon which a shocking act of public degradation and its inevitable righteous reversal would unfold. In the coming minutes, as a white police officer prepared to carry out a humiliating, staged act under the guise of procedure, the true mark of courage and dignity, long suppressed and waiting to be unleashed, would emerge from the shadows. And as the echoes of that fateful moment resonated, Chicago would be forced to confront a truth that could no longer be ignored. The courthouse's somber corridors, steeped in the weight of history and the echoes of past injustices, buzzed with a nervous anticipation that day. Under cover of a meticulously constructed disguise, Vanessa Brixon, her identity still hidden beneath an assumed persona, sat in the defendant's chair, her posture a blend of quiet resolve and palpable apprehension. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully engineered to pass as an ordinary accused citizen in this arena notorious for its biased practices. Yet beneath that unassuming mask lay a burning commitment to expose the systemic cruelty that had plagued Chicago's law enforcement for far too long. As the proceedings commenced, the hushed murmurs in the courtroom gave way to a tense silence, a silence that was soon shattered by the clamor of a shocking and premeditated spectacle. In a move that had been rehearsed and justified as procedure by those who wielded power without conscience, a white police officer known on the force for his aggressive tactics strode purposefully into the courtroom. His uniform was immaculate, his demeanor clinical. He carried himself with an unsettling blend of authority and entitlement. With his eyes fixed on the trembling figure seated before him, he announced his intention with a detached finality that sent shivers through every watching soul. Following the scripted protocol for what was termed evidence gathering in cases of suspected misconduct, the officer directed the attention of the room to the defendant Vanessa, still under her false identity. For the sake of procedure, he declared loudly, his voice reverberating off the cold walls, we will now complete a standard identification and processing measure. His tone, dismissive and calculated, left no room for objections. The innocent-seeming defendant, whose silence had long been misinterpreted as non-compliance, was suddenly thrust into a humiliating spotlight. At that very moment, a discreet overhead surveillance camera whirred to life, capturing every unsettling detail for posterity. The officer's gloved hand reached for a set of clippers, a tool repurposed that day not for a benign administrative task, but as an instrument of domination and degradation. In a swift, mechanically precise motion, he began shaving off the hair of the detained woman. With each pass of the clippers, lock after lock of her curly, resilient hair, a physical emblem of her identity, her heritage, and her personal history, fell to the polished floor. The sound of whirring clippers mingled with the collective gasps of those assembled in the courtroom. The public humiliation was total and unforgiving. Members of the jury, attorneys, and spectators alike sat transfixed. Some covered their eyes in shock, while others recorded the incident on their mobile devices. The officer's sneering expression, punctuated by intermittent glances towards the onlookers, betrayed a disturbing sense of satisfaction, as though this act of invasive indignity were nothing more than a trivial exercise in enforcing order. His comments, laced with a callous blend of institutional justification and personal disdain, echoed in the silent courtroom. This is for your own good, a standard measure to ensure identification and adherence to protocol. Among the crowd, whispers quickly began to swirl. Court clerks exchanged uncomfortable looks as they filed official reports, while a group of young civil rights advocates in the gallery sat rigidly, their eyes burning with silent indignation. The stark contrast between the clinical detachment of the officer and the unmistakable human suffering etched on the woman's face created a dissonance that could not be ignored. Every shorn lock of hair underscored not only the physical violation of her dignity, but also symbolized the systemic suppression of voices like hers, voices that had long been drowned out by the brute forces of prejudice and authority. For Vanessa, the experience was both excruciating and transformative. Despite the searing humiliation, an inner fortitude, honed by years of witnessing injustice, kept her from crumbling entirely. Though her eyes remained downcast and her silence seemed imposed, each fallen strand of hair carried the weight of her unspoken legacy. In that agonizing moment, she was acutely aware of the duality of the act. It was intended to break her spirit, to reduce her to a symbol of disgrace, yet it inadvertently laid bare the raw injustice of the system for everyone present. The act of public degradation, executed in the guise of following procedure, became a damning indictment of a system rigged against the very people it professed to protect. Even as the officer continued his task with mechanical precision, a murmur of discontent began to ripple through the courtroom. A seasoned prosecutor, whose face had been set in a mask of polite neutrality, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the severity of what he was witnessing gnawing at the edges of his long-standing silence. Similarly, some jurors exchanged glances loaded with unvoiced accusations, a silent recognition that this was a moment when the abuse of power had reached an intolerable zenith. In that fateful scene, the boundaries between procedure and cruelty, between authority and arrogance, were irreversibly shattered. The white officer, oblivious to the shifting currents of collective outrage, maintained his professional veneer as if the shorn hair and the resultant spectacle were nothing more than a necessary inconvenience. But for those who witnessed the atrocity, the indelible image of a dignified woman reduced to that state of degradation would be seared into memory, an image destined to fuel a growing demand for accountability and change. Little did the officer know, amidst the orchestrated chaos of humiliation and public shame unfolding in that federal courtroom, that the true metamorphosis was only just beginning. The wear and tear of his actions would soon be repaid, not in the currency of punishment alone but in a reckoning that would force him to stand, quite literally, on the other side of the law. The seeds of transformation had been sown. In the charged stillness that followed the officer's shocking act of public humiliation, the atmosphere in the federal courtroom shifted forcefully. No longer were the proceedings about a routine case or even a single incident of abuse. Now, the court had to confront a deeper, systemic rot. Mere minutes after the degrading spectacle had taken place, murmurs swelled through the gallery, and murmurs of outrage soon evolved into an unyielding clamor for accountability. The stark image of a dignified woman being humiliated, her identity hidden beneath an assumed guise to infiltrate a system steeped in prejudice, had ignited a torrent of indignation that could no longer be contained. The presiding prosecutor, a seasoned figure whose career had been defined by witnessing a cascade of injustices in Chicago's urban underbelly, stepped forward into the hushed space. His voice, firm yet imbued with restrained passion, declared that the incident, though unsanctioned and draped in the guise of ordinary procedure, represented only the latest in a long line of documented abuses. Under these conditions, the courtroom was now tasked with a new hearing, to formally address cases of excessive force and brutality attached to this very officer, whose violent practices had become emblematic of an institutional culture that had for too long ignored the cries of the oppressed. At the outset, the judge presiding over the new hearing was not yet revealed. Legal clerks shuffled papers and adjusted microphones. The case file on the aggressive officer had been compiled over months, the result of countless witness statements, whistleblower testimonies from within the precinct, and a painstakingly aggregated log of previous allegations. The charges, emblematic of institutional neglect, were clear: persistent use of excessive force, violations of civil rights, and a pattern of systemic brutality targeting communities of color. This officer, dressed in the crisp uniform of Chicago's police force and now freshly stained by his latest act, was slated to be confronted not as a servant of justice, but as a defendant whose record of misconduct cried out for redress. The courtroom, which only minutes ago had trembled under the weight of an unspeakable humiliation, now bristled with anticipation. The gallery's collective gaze turned from whispers of disbelief to watchful, determined eyes, as if every individual present understood that the stage was set for a historic confrontation, a reckoning that would reshuffle the scales of justice in a system mired by its legacy of prejudice. The officer, standing stiffly in his designated place, could not hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Under the glare of the media's unblinking lenses and the silent scrutiny of those who had witnessed his cruelty firsthand, his previous arrogance had slowly dissolved into palpable apprehension. With a shuffling of pages and a brief pause that seemed weighted with historical consequence, the door to the judge's chambers opened. From behind that heavy oak door, steps echoed down the corridor, and then the transformation began. The undercover defendant, who until now had been subjected to humiliation and silent indignities, was ushered away with quiet urgency by court officers. In a maneuver planned with precise care to protect the undercover identity and to build the narrative of retribution, she was led off stage, out of the sight of the attentive audience. Whispers fluttered through the courtroom like a rising crescendo of disbelief and speculation, but no one could yet discern what was unfolding behind the closed doors. As the courtroom settled into a tense rhythm of procedural formality, the prosecution began to present its case against the officer. Testimonies from former victims, accompanied by damning video evidence and meticulously documented timelines of abuse, were laid bare. An expert witness, whose reputation for ethics and integrity preceded him, took the stand to speak of the officer's tactics. How repeated patterns of aggression, masked as standard procedure, had systematically marginalized and dehumanized those trapped in the crosshairs of an aggressive policing mandate. His voice resonated throughout the hushed chamber, each word hammering home the collective pain born of decades of discrimination and violence. The narrative was stark and uncompromising, painting a picture of a man whose actions were not isolated missteps but rather a deliberate, systemic abuse of power. At the center of this unfolding drama, the courtroom's energy surged into visual focus. The officer's once imperious demeanor had dwindled to a semblance of anxious vulnerability as he was confronted with a litany of evidence. His eyes darted about, as if seeking a hidden fortress of justification among the sterile documents and impassive faces of the legal panel. With the mounting pressure, subtle cracks appeared in his previously unassailable facade. The realization was dawning. He was not merely acting on isolated instincts of aggression, but his entire career, his very identity as a lawman, was being unraveled before the eyes of a system finally demanding accountability. Then, as if the weight of centuries of systemic injustice were converging upon this singular moment, an unexpected hush fell over the room. A flurry of whispered conversations ceased, replaced by a profound silence that settled with almost tangible intensity across the courtroom. At that moment, the door at the far end of the hall swung open once more. An officer escorted a figure toward the bench, and gasps rippled through the audience. Slowly, deliberately, the shrouded identity of the woman who had been the victim of that degrading act was to be unveiled, revealed not as an ordinary defendant, but as one whose true identity struck at the very heart of discomfort in this chamber. For as those gathered assumed that the proceedings were over and the act had relegated her to shame, she was being prepared to reclaim her power in the most extraordinary manner. In the ensuing minutes, every eye was glued to the threshold, their hearts beating in anxious unison. The new hearing, originally designed to scrutinize and punish the film of brutality, was now poised on the cusp of a dramatic twist that would force every participant to confront not just the actions of a single officer, but the deficiencies of a system that had long bred such cruelty. Nobody yet knew that the meaning of justice was about to be redefined within these very walls, a moment when the oppressed would step forward, not as the silent subjects of degradation, but as the resolute arbiters of their own dignity. The proceedings resumed in the stark, echoing courtroom as a new chapter in the case was set to unfold. With the humiliating act still fresh on everyone's minds, the judge's gavel fell once again, calling the court to order and heralding a hearing that would focus on long-standing allegations of excessive force by the same officer. The gallery, which had watched in horrified silence during the initial incident, now brimmed with an expectant tension. Every seat was filled by people who had come not only to observe a legal proceeding but to witness, perhaps for the first time, the long-awaited reckoning of a system steeped in inequality. At the front of the courtroom, the prosecuting attorney, a veteran of civil rights litigation, took the podium with measured yet forceful authority. His voice resonated as he began to recount a litany of abuses that spanned years. He opened with testimony from longtime community members who had suffered under similar acts of police brutality, describing in detail how excessive force had been a regular occurrence for marginalized citizens in Chicago. The attorney's words painted a grim picture, a pattern that was not accidental but systematic, a culture of aggression and disregard for human dignity. Being meticulous in his presentation, he introduced video evidence and official reports that documented multiple incidents where the officer in question had crossed the boundaries of lawful conduct. On large screens flanking the witness stand, grainy surveillance clips and shaky handheld videos played. The images were harrowing, scenes of angry confrontations, panicked pleas for mercy, and the unmistakable display of force that had dehumanized innocent individuals. One clip, taken during a previous arrest, showed the officer's face hardened as he barked orders, his gloved hand raised in a manner that brimmed with unrestrained aggression. Each piece of evidence was laid out like a damning mosaic, forcing the onlookers to confront how deeply the abuse ran. The prosecuting attorney pressed on, emphasizing that each incident was not isolated. They collectively testified to a disturbing modus operandi that had thrived in a system riddled with unchecked authority. As the testimony unfolded, the defense attempted to mount its argument with canonical rhetoric about standard procedures and necessary actions under stressful circumstances. The officer, now standing in the defendant's dock, was forced to listen as his record was dissected detail by detail. His once unyielding posture began to falter under the relentless scrutiny. His eyes, once filled with the confidence of unquestioned authority, now betrayed flickers of apprehension. With every new piece of evidence, even the air in the room seemed to thicken with the collective weight of before and after, of humiliation retributively set against an unbroken chain of misconduct. An expert witness, a respected criminologist with years of research on police behavior, was called to testify next. Calmly and methodically, she deconstructed the officer's claim of following protocol. She explained that true procedure could never justify the intentional and public degradation inflicted upon a detained individual. Her words struck home as she recounted how the officer's actions had not only violated internal guidelines, but had also violated fundamental human rights. The expert delineated the psychology behind such acts of overreach, describing how dehumanization often began with the stripping away of one's identity, symbolized so powerfully by the act of forcibly shaving someone's hair. For her, this was a tactile and irreversible measure of control, one that left scars far deeper than the physical. Throughout the hearing, members of the public and civil rights advocates in the gallery seemed to lean forward in their seats, riveted by the unfolding narrative. They exchanged meaningful looks, as if the aggregated evidence formed an unspoken alliance among those who had long suffered at the hands of abuse. The witness testimonies, backed by meticulous documentation, began to chip away at any vestige of justification for the officer's behavior. Every statement, every fact, reinforced the idea that the degradation carried out in the courtroom had been merely the latest act in a continuing saga of systemic brutality. In a particularly wrenching moment, a young man who had experienced excessive force during a community protest was called to testify. Amidst his trembling voice, he recounted, in harrowing detail, the scarring physical and psychological effects of being targeted simply because of the color of his skin. His narrative, the despair, the anger, and the unmistakable plea for dignity, brought many in the room to a collective, pained attention. His testimony was punctuated by tearful pauses, and for a few heartbeats, the courtroom was united in an empathetic silence that spoke louder than any legal argument ever could. Simultaneously, the defense team attempted to raise doubts about the reliability of some of the submitted evidence and question the motivations behind the extensive documentation of the officer's past records. But as the days of record and the multitude of victim accounts were laid bare, their efforts increasingly appeared as desperate maneuvers to obscure the truth. A palpable shift had taken place. The narrative was no longer about isolated procedural deviations, but about an entrenched pattern of abuse that had been methodically recorded over time. A palpable undercurrent of justice pulsed through the room as the prosecution concluded its presentation. The charged atmosphere was underscored by the determined eyes of community members, activists, and all those who had dared to hope that accountability might finally be more than a distant promise. Just at that moment, a murmur began to circulate among the attendees, an undercurrent that hinted at the imminent revelation of something far more profound. The defense, having exhausted its standard arguments with diminishing effect, fell quiet for a few tense moments. The officer's gaze fell to the floor, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched the folder of his defense statements. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that the scales of justice were beginning to tip inexorably in favor of accountability. The evidence's heavy gravity was undeniable, a relentless accumulation that would not be easily dismissed. As the session drew on, a hushed anticipation gripped the chamber. Behind closed doors, legal aides exchanged glances heavy with the knowledge that what was to come might alter the course of not only this trial, but also the broader discourse on systemic abuse in law enforcement. And, in a moment that promised to redefine the proceedings entirely, the courtroom doors at the back began to open slowly. All eyes shifted toward that corridor, where whispers bled into a roar of speculation. Something, or rather someone, was about to step forward, an individual whose true identity would soon shatter every preconception held by the gathered authorities, the media, and the community alike. As the relentless presentation of evidence pressed on, witnesses, testimonies, and damning digital records interlaced to form an unassailable case against the officer. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly electric with anticipation. The heavy weight of documented brutality bore down on every participant. Yet amid this mounting storm of accountability, an even greater revelation was quietly being prepared behind closed doors. In the midst of a meticulously arranged recess intended to allow the court time to review the overwhelming evidence, the door at the far end of the chamber began to open with a measured, deliberate creak. Heads turned simultaneously, and the hushed murmur of voices in the gallery and among the legal teams fell into a suspended silence. Every individual in the room sensed that something extraordinary was about to occur, a moment that would shake the very foundations of the proceedings. From behind the door, escorted by two uniformed bailiffs, stepped a figure draped in a long, dark robe. The person's measured steps and composed bearing demanded attention even before any words were spoken. Slowly, deliberately, the hood that had shielded the identity of the individual was lifted, revealing a face etched with years of quiet fortitude and unyielding resolve. In that transcendent moment, the undercover defendant was unmistakably revealed. It was none other than Judge Vanessa Brixon herself, the woman who had been operating under a false guise in order to silently investigate and expose the deep-seated abuses within the system. A complete and profound hush fell over the courtroom. The revelation rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Every eye in the room, attorneys, jurors, courtroom staff, and even members of the press, registered gasps of disbelief. Vanessa's appearance here was no mere formality. It was a strategic, soul-stirring act of reclaiming dignity and authority. The judge's once-concealed identity shimmered with the quiet power of long-endured truths, and for a moment, time itself seemed to suspend. At the center of this historic unveiling, the once haughty and aggressively confident officer now stood frozen. His face drained of color, and his every posture wavered as the realization of what he had just committed crashed upon him like an icy torrent. In seconds, his earlier smirk and arrogant assurance were replaced by an expression of abject shock and regret. The man, who had so recently exhibited a calculated cruelty by shamelessly shaving the head of an accused, believing her to be just another troubled defendant, now found himself staring into the unyielding, steely eyes of a woman who held the highest judicial authority in the room. Across the courtroom, a complex tapestry of emotions unfurled. The defense attorneys, who had earlier attempted to cast doubt on the systematic nature of the abuses, now struggled to maintain their composure. Questions and murmurs of disbelief rippled among them. Some exchanged uneasy glances with colleagues, acknowledging that the very institution they represented was now being forcefully confronted by an emblem of justice they had long since underestimated. The prosecuting team, steeled by their relentless pursuit of truth, maintained a respectful silence as they witnessed the bride of retribution take shape before their eyes. In the gallery, members of the public who had come seeking accountability and reform found their hearts pounding with a mixture of vindication and awe. Activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike sat riveted as Judge Brixon, her features calm yet resolute, ascended the bench. The transformation was complete. The woman who moments before had been demeaned by unchecked authority was repositioned at the epicenter of the courtroom, her presence now serving as the fulcrum upon which justice was set to pivot. Judge Vanessa Brixon surveyed the courtroom with eyes that burned with quiet fury and dignified sorrow. Each line on her face testified to years of witnessing injustice, and now every observer was forced to confront that accumulated pain. The silence that had descended was not empty. It was pregnant with expectation, with the unspoken promise of accountability. In that moment, the roles in the courtroom were irrevocably inverted. The power that once resided with those who disrespected her had been turned against them. A charged, almost tangible energy flowed through the room as every witness realized that the officer's heinous act, once shrouded as a standard procedure, would now be judged by a woman whose life had been dedicated to the pursuit of justice and reform. The reaction from the officer was visceral and immediate. His eyes darted around, desperately seeking escape or a semblance of justification that would undo what he had done. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, a silent testament to the internal collapse of his earlier arrogance. Meanwhile, whispers among the assembled lawyers and spectators grew louder, their shock mingled with a dawning recognition that this was no ordinary day in the federal courthouse. The balance of power, so long tilted in favor of systemic abuse, was now precariously repositioned in favor of accountability. In that still, breathless moment, where the cold, hard evidence of the past met the warm, resolute glow of newfound justice, every individual present was forced to reckon with a truth that could no longer be confined to whispered accusations or hidden dossiers. The courtroom, once a stage lined with the trappings of institutional indifference, had now become a symbol of unyielding dignity. The appearance of Judge Vanessa Brixon was a dramatic declaration that those in power must answer for their actions, and that justice, when truly served, recognizes neither hierarchy nor fear. There came a moment in the hushed, charged courtroom when the weight of accumulated suffering and systemic injustice could no longer be confined to silence. With measured dignity and controlled resolve, Judge Vanessa Brixon rose from the bench, her eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd as if to gather every shard of their collective pain and hope. The once overpowering whispers of shock and disbelief gave way to an expectant quiet, as every soul in the courtroom instinctively knew that what was to follow was more than a recitation of legal pronouncements. It was the unveiling of a moral reckoning. With a deep breath, Vanessa began, her voice resonating like a clarion bell, clear and unwavering through the cavernous hall. Today, we stand at the crossroads of injustice and the enduring strength of dignity, she declared, her words imbued with the weight of personal loss and the storied history of systemic cruelty. For far too long, in the heart of our city and in the very halls of justice, the voices of the marginalized have been silenced, their identities stripped away not only in body but in spirit. This courtroom has witnessed acts that were disguised as standard procedures, acts intended to humiliate and demean, rather than to serve justice. No more. Her eyes glistened with a mixture of sorrow and fierce determination as she continued. I have walked many dark roads, seen the cruelty inflicted upon those who could not fight back, and felt the sting of humiliation that burns deep into one's soul. I have felt the loss of what made me whole, and in my silence, I learned that true power does not lie in the force of a clipped blade or in the shock of a degrading act. It lies in the steadfast resilience of the human spirit, in the honor of those who, despite their wounds, dare to stand and speak the truth. Vanessa paused, letting the significance of her words settle into every corner of the room. The act you witnessed today, this deliberate, callous stripping away of my identity, was meant to reduce me to a symbol of shame. They wanted to diminish the worth of a life and a legacy. But know this, no amount of coercion, no crude procedure, no authoritarian decree can extinguish the flame of truth that burns within each of us. Every strand of hair that was forcibly taken, every mark of degradation etched onto the inside of this institution, only serves as a reminder that our humanity cannot be erased. It is in our very scars that our stories are inscribed. Her voice strengthened, drawing on the collective memory of every individual who had ever suffered at the hands of unchecked authority. I stand before you not as a defeated defendant, but as a judge, a guardian of the very principles of justice that this courtroom is meant to uphold. Let my presence here, as I reclaim the dignity that was so viciously stripped away, be a beacon to every person who has ever been told that their worth is less than another's, that their voice is too quiet to matter. True justice is not found in the tyranny of oppressive rules or the cold detachment of tradition. It is found in the courage to acknowledge pain, to honor the struggles behind every silent cry, and to transform that pain into an unyielding demand for change. The judge's tone, at once both compassionate and unyielding, filled the courtroom with a palpable energy. I have no illusions about the system that has long perpetuated intolerance and cruelty, she continued. But I do know that today marks a turning point. We have gathered evidence of systemic abuses. We have recorded every testimony of hurt, every account of excessive force, and every voice that has been gagged by the heavy hand of injustice. This is not simply a legal proceeding, it is a moral imperative. Our community, our city, and our nation deserve a justice that does not hide behind procedural formalities, but confronts each transgression with the full force of ethical accountability. She swept her gaze over the faces in the room. Attorneys, jurors, advocates, victims, and every pair of eyes seemed to mirror the hope that resonated in her words. I call upon not only those who have been wronged in this very room, but also every member of our community who has felt the sting of dehumanization. Let us transform our collective anguish into a catalyst for reform. Let us tear down the walls of indifference and prejudice that have held sway for far too long. Hold fast to the belief that justice, when pursued with unwavering determination, can indeed become a living, breathing force that restores dignity and humanizes those who have been devalued. Her voice softened slightly as she reached the climax of her address. A call to action as much as it was an invocation of shared humanity. Today, I reclaim not only my honor but the honor of every individual who has suffered in silence. I may have lost my hair in a moment of cruelty, but I have gained something far more profound. The unwavering conviction that our collective dignity, the power of our voice, and the relentless pursuit of truth can never be taken away. Let this courtroom, this day, serve as a reminder that no act of degradation will ever be able to silence the call for justice that echoes in our hearts. For when we stand united in the face of injustice, even the most powerful force can, and will, be held accountable. A heavy silence followed as her words reverberated off the courtroom walls, each syllable leaving an indelible mark upon the hearts of those present. In that profound stillness, even the oppressive air of authority seemed to quiver in acknowledgement of a new era dawning. A moment when dignity, truth, and justice would no longer be subdued by the weight of historical atrocities. As the gavel struck its final, resonant note, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom, one that was filled with a cocktail of relief, righteous anger, and trembling hope. After hours of testimony, damning evidence, and soul-searching appeals for accountability, the federal judge delivered a verdict that would not only rewrite the narrative of systemic abuse in Chicago, but also echo far beyond the confines of the courtroom. In a firm, deliberate tone that cut through decades of impunity, the judge pronounced that the white officer, whose callous act of public humiliation had once been masked as procedure, was found guilty on multiple counts: excessive use of force, violation of civil rights, and executing an act meant solely for the sake of dominating a vulnerable individual. The decision declared that his conduct was not isolated. It was symptomatic of a long history of brutality and discrimination that the system had allowed to fester. The sentence was both punitive and symbolic. The officer was suspended immediately from active duty pending a full departmental review, and an independent investigative commission was set in motion to examine not just his past actions but the broader patterns of misconduct within the precinct. As the verdict was broadcast live, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of subdued murmurs and determined applause, a collective recognition that for the first time in many long years, the scales of justice were tipping in favor of those who had long suffered in silence. Every eye in the room glistened with unshed tears as the weight of accountability finally settled upon a man whose arrogance had once seemed untouchable. Beyond the walls of the courtroom, the effects of the verdict rippled out like shockwaves through the city. Out on the busy streets of Chicago, news of the decision ignited impassioned protests and vigils. Community leaders and civil rights groups hailed the ruling as a turning point in the struggle against police brutality and institutional racism. Banners were raised, chants of justice for every silenced voice filled the air, and an atmosphere of renewed determination pulsed through neighborhoods that had long been disenfranchised. The verdict not only represented a rare instance of institutional accountability but also rekindled hope that entrenched systems of abuse could indeed be challenged. Inside the police department, the turmoil was palpable. Senior officials scrambled to address the growing outcry from within their ranks and from the public at large. New directives were issued: mandatory bias and sensitivity training, a complete internal review of use of force tactics, and the creation of an oversight committee with community representation. For many officers, this was a wake-up call, a recognition that the legacy of mistreatment could no longer be ignored. The officer's conviction was a watershed moment, casting an unyielding spotlight on policies that had, for far too long, emboldened brutality. There were voices within the force who quietly vowed to work for reform, understanding that a just system not only protected its citizens, but also preserved the honor of all who took an oath to serve. In the wake of the trial, media outlets, legal analysts, and social commentators began to dissect the proceedings. Editorials highlighted how the case served as a catalyst for systemic change, an unyielding declaration that no one was above the law. The verdict was celebrated as a moral triumph, a reminder that even after endless years of suppression, the insistence on dignity and truth could not be permanently silenced. Across news cycles, headlines proclaimed the emergence of a new era in justice, sparking debates and inspiring other affected communities to stand up and demand comprehensive reform. Yet perhaps the most profound transformation was the personal journey of the woman whose dignity had been violently stripped away, only to be reclaimed with resounding authority. After the verdict, when the hall had finally emptied of its factions, lawyers, journalists, activists, and the weary faces of those who had long been oppressed, Judge Vanessa Brixon allowed herself a moment of solitude. Later that evening, in the quiet aftermath of a storm of retribution and hope, she found herself alone in her modest chambers. The weight of the day's events still lingered, a mixture of sorrow for the countless lives scarred by injustice and pride in the hard-won victory for accountability. In the dim light of a solitary desk lamp, Vanessa slowly approached a large, time-worn mirror that hung on the wall, a silent witness to battles fought and won. Her eyes, though still resolute, shimmered with vulnerability as she took a moment to face the reflection before her. There, where once her long, dark hair had framed her determined face, now lay a smooth, unadorned canvas, a reminder of the cruel humiliation inflicted upon her. With deliberate tenderness, she reached up and touched the bare skin of her scalp, feeling the cool reality of the loss. In that reflective, deeply personal moment, the hardship of the past and the promise of a fiercely hopeful future converged into a singular, powerful acknowledgement. Softly, and with a quiet strength that belied the raging storm outside and within, she whispered to her reflection, "I lost my hair, but not my voice." Those words were not simply a statement of physical change, but an affirmation of an enduring spirit that would continue to speak truth to power, no matter how many times they attempted to silence it. They were a promise that every act of degradation could be met with a surge of dignity, and every attempt to break a spirit would only fuel the fire for change. In that final, cathartic scene, the legacy of Judge Vanessa Brixon was cemented, not just as the woman who exposed systemic cruelty, but as an enduring symbol of resilience, moral fortitude, and the transformative power of reclaiming one's dignity. Her journey, a testimony of enduring courage in the face of relentless oppression, resonated far beyond the courtroom. It ignited conversations, sparked policy reforms, and fostered a community determined to ensure that justice, in all its true form, was never compromised again. He wanted to humiliate her, but his cruelty was undone by her unyielding dignity. Subscribe if you believe that justice has a voice, even when those in power try to force it into silence.